Hi everyone, welcome to another video. Today I want to share with you how to make this super simple handmade teacher's card. You're only going to use a few supplies. Here's a look at that list, and I will be using the back to school clear stamp set from Joy Clair Stamps. Now let's go ahead and walk through the other supplies. You can use a paper trimmer, or you can just use scissors. Both will work, or actually you do need scissors whether or not you have a paper trimmer. I'm also going to be using some black dye ink. I'm using Simon Says stamp. Any black dye ink will work. That's just the easiest ink I could think of. Everybody needs or has a black dyeing pad. You're also going to need an acrylic black for this clear stamp set. If you don't have an acrylic black, you can use a cup. I've seen people use plates, like a clear plate, or something along those lines, just something to attach it, a handle, so you can stamp your stamps. You're also going to need adhesive. I'm using dimensional and glossy accents. It's also going to be my embellishment, which is why I chose glossy accents. And then I'm going to be using 3 colors of cardstock, white, red, and yellow. If you don't have red and yellow cardstock, you can always use your white cardstock and a red and yellow marker. Or colored pencils would also work, anything to get your color or your cardstock a red and yellow color. I'll also be using this back to school stamp set from Joy Clair Stamps. I'll be using quite a few of the images in this set, so you'll get to see a variety of them used. Now the first thing I want to do is go ahead and make my card base. Now I have a 8.5 sheet by 11 sheet of white cardstock. This is heavyweight, and I'm going to cut it right down the middle so it measures 4 1/4 by 11 inches. Now one piece I'm going to set aside. If you're making more than one card, you could keep these both the same length and then cut another piece of cardstock. But I want to go ahead and cut this second sheet that I have in half again, so it's 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. That's an A2 size panel, and that's what I'm going to be doing the majority of my stamping on. To make my card base, I'm going to take that longer sheet, fold it in half, and now this measures 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, but it's got that fold on top, so you have your card base ready to go. Now normally I would use a bone folder, but I'm using minimal supplies, so I just use my fingernail to do the scoring on that. For my stamping, if you wanted to, you could completely skip stamping on this panel and stamp straight on your card base, but I like to add a little bit of heft with this extra panel, so that's why I'm doing it this way. However, if you wanted to, you could always stamp straight on the card base. I've also got my black dye ink pad ready to go, and because I haven't used some of the stamps in this set quite yet, I want to go ahead and ink them up and stamp them off to the side first. That's going to prime them a little bit, make sure they stamp a little better. I've also got my 4.5 by 5.5 sheet of cardstock, and I've got a piece of computer paper underneath that to catch all the extra ink so I don't smear any on my card panel while I'm working. If you wanted to, you could add a mouse pad, a thick magazine, a thick notebook, a piece of fun foam underneath this, and that's going to help with your stamping as well. So I'm going to create my own pattern paper with this stamp set. That's what I'm doing right now. So I started off with a little bus image, inked it up, stamped it down, and I have stamped it to where it is hanging off on the right hand side and on the bottom as well. That's the thing about pattern paper. When you cut it down, you cut images in half. You can't help it. That's just how it works. So in order to make this look a little bit more realistic, like I've cut a piece of pattern paper down, I want to make sure I have images hanging off the edges. Then the rest of these, I'm just going to take the rest of the images in this set, ink them up, and stamp them down and create kind of like a puzzle with them. Just seeing which image fits best in the opening that I have available and stamping it down. Now whenever I do this, I like to choose a side or corner to start in and work my way from that. I don't like to start in the middle and work my way out. You could if that's your way of doing things, but for this one I started in the bottom right hand corner, and I'm going to work my way up and over, and that's what works for me. Now you can see I am doing this where I clean each stamp in between and then go on to a different stamp. If you are an experienced crafter and you have your stash of supplies, you can always load up stamps onto different acrylic blocks and you don't have to do the cleaning and switching out like I'm doing here. But I wanted to show you how you could do this with just one acrylic block. Also, I should mention this acrylic block I'm using here, I got from the dollar bin at Joann's or Michael's. I think it was Joann's. So you can find really cheap acrylic blocks. Now, if you just seen what happened on the screen, I had to look straight over. You seen my hair in the frame. What happens sometimes when you stamp acrylic stamps, or any stamp for that matter, sometimes you don't get the best impression. The good thing about your clear stamps is you get to look straight through them over the top, and you can line them up and re-stamp right on top of the image you've already done, so I didn't have to throw this whole panel away and start over. Also, if you're not comfortable doing that and you miss stamp, just use a black pen or a fine tip black marker to fill this in when you're all done, and you won't have to start over your panel as well. Just a little tip if you're going in and trying to do this in one go. Now, if you wanted to take this one step further, you could color in these images and make it a nice, bright, colorful pattern paper. You could use alcohol markers. If you don't have alcohol markers like Copics or whatnot, you can use Sharpies, you can use colored pencils, whatever you might have on hand to give it a little bit of color. I'm going to be leaving mine black and white today though. If it gets to this point, it's just a matter of filling in all the little edges where you might think it needs a little something extra, which I'll do right here with that ruler. And then there is a final look at the paper, all finished and ready to go on our card base. Now, if you were making several cards, remember you could always stamp a whole 8.5 sheet by 11 sheet of paper and then cut it down. Then you don't have to do all this with every single panel. Now, moving on, it was time to stamp my sentiment. So I am using the large It Takes a Big Heart to Inspire a Little Mind sentiment in this set. And normally what I would do was either use a die cut that I like that fit this sentiment, or I would measure my sentiment and then cut my panel and then stamp on it. But I didn't want to add a ruler to my list, so I'm going to do this a way where you don't need to do any measuring at all. So I've got my piece of white cardstock. Now you can stamp this on any surface, but to make sure I get a good impression, I do have a piece of fun foam underneath my computer paper. If you don't have fun foam, you can use a stack of paper, a notebook, a large magazine, a mouse pad, anything to give it a little bit of cushion under that. It's going to help you get a better impression. I'm also using my black dye ink and inking up my stamp really well. I primed it beforehand, stamped it off a few times, and now I'll line it up with the bottom left-hand corner of this piece of cardstock. Now I lined it up on the bottom and the left-hand side, making sure I had it where I wanted it on those two sides. I'll worry about the rest later. And for my heart, I want to go ahead and stamp that part of the sentiment on the red cardstock. I don't need the whole thing, I just want the heart. And then on my yellow cardstock, I just want the light bulb. And like I said, if you don't have red and yellow cardstock, use a marker, use a colored pencil to color in white cardstock, or use pattern paper if you like that better, and bam, you have yourself colored cardstock ready to go. Now to go ahead and cut down my sentiment, I'm just going to eyeball this in my paper trimmer and cut off the right hand side and the top so it's all equal around 4 sides. And I'm going to do the same exact thing to mat this. Normally I would use a die cut or I would measure, but I'm going to do this without any measuring at all. So I've got some glossy accents, which is a strong glue. I'll also be using it as an embellishment later on. I'm going to lay this in the bottom left-hand corner of this red piece of cardstock. I'll go ahead and place it, make sure it's even on the bottom and the left-hand side, and then I'll place my acrylic block on top of that with something heavy. You can use a book on top of that, a plate, just something to give it a little bit of pressure so it lays nice and flat against your cardstock and really secures. Now, while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and fussy cut out my other images on my colored cardstock. Now, I'll be using my scissors and just cutting around this heart and the light bulb that I've stamped out. The best advice I've ever gotten while fussy cutting is to turn your paper and not your scissors. That's going to allow you to get into those little places. Now, the majority of the time after I do fussy cutting, I run a black marker along the cut edges. If you don't have a black marker, don't worry, you don't have to. or you can run your fussy cut images along your black ink pad. Now these are small, your fingers will get a little inky, but I don't mind that. I didn't do that today though, just because that's kind of a more, something I didn't even learn about until a few years ago. So you don't have to do it. So I left it out. Now for my sentiment, now that it's glued down on my mat, I'm going to go ahead and cut off the right hand side and the top so they're even to the bottom and the side. And this is just a very easy way to measure out and mat your sentiments without any extra tools. Now for those fussy cut images, I am going to pop them up over their places on the sentiment that they fill in. Now, like I said before, if you don't have colored cardstock, you can always just color in white cardstock and then fussy cut and add this over. And I'm also using dimensional adhesive here. If you don't have dimensional adhesive or you don't want to add that onto your supply list, just use your liquid glue and glue these down. You don't need the dimension. I just kind of like the way it looks. So I place those down on top of the sentiment, and now it's time to start putting this card together on the card base. Now I'm going to take my panel and glue it down onto my A2 top folding card base, which I showed you how to make in the beginning. Now I'm using glossy accents here, and I want to make sure I go around all four sides and then place quite a bit in the middle as well, so everything secures down. If you want to skip this step, you can always just stamp straight onto your card bases, and then you don't have to worry about it. So I'll go ahead and get all the glue all over the back of that, and then line that up with my card base and just give it a nice press. Make sure everything's firmly in place. And then I like to place either a large book. I used my sewing kit on top of this just because that's what I had right there, but a large book, a plate, whatever you have that's hefty and big to give it a little pressure. Now for my sentiment panel, I'm going to go ahead and put some more glossy accents right on the back of it. You don't have to worry about this going anywhere too. This is a really strong glue as well as an embellisher. So I'll put this sentiment panel right down in the center, and I didn't think beforehand when I added my dimension. You might want to add it after so you get a nice secure attachment without all the fuss, but I didn't, so I just worked around that and used my fingers to press it down. Now on the inside, I'm going to use the thank you sentiment in black dye ink and stamp that right in the center of the inside of the card. And then there's also these two little sentiments that kind of finish off that saying. I'm choosing for being my teacher. I'll go ahead and load that onto my acrylic block, ink that up with my black dye ink, and I'm going to put that right on the left hand side. Now, like I said many times before, I'm going to be using my glossy accents not only as a glue, but as my embellishment as well. So this is an awesome little tool to have in your craft room. It's got this great nozzle on the top, so you get precision placement with it. And what you can use it for is to create little droplets that look like water. They'll dry crystal clear, but I'm going to put it on top of my heart. And this is going to create a nice glaze, a nice hard shiny coat that's dimensional on top of that. And I'll also put it on top of my light bulb. This just makes them, it gives them a little bit of a glassy look. You'll see in the finished photos just how dimensional and cool this really looks once it's dried. And it's just a great way to add a little embellishment where you may not have gems or pearls or whatever on hand, but this you can use as a glue, you can use it as embellishment, and you're good to go on your card. There you can see it's a little cloudy now, but it does dry clear. You'll see in the finished photos. But once that was on, I set this aside to dry, and that's going to finish off the card for today. This glossy accents does take a little bit of time to dry, so this isn't a card you can finish in like 15 minutes because it does have that dry time. But once that's dry, that's all there is to it. Here's a look at the few finished photos that I have for you. I gave you many ways you could step this card up a notch if you wanted to, but I think it's beautiful and fun as is and great for any teacher that you might have that you need a quick card for. Here's one last look, and you can see the shine on that heart that I made. But that does it for me today. I'm going to leave you guys with these few links. Thank you so much for watching today, and happy crafting.